A 67-year-old man came to me last year, and at first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He was calm, well-groomed, mentally sharp. He spoke with confidence, and more importantly, he believed he was doing everything right for his health. He told me he had never smoked in his life. Not even socially. He had no known family history of heart disease, and he followed what he described as a clean, disciplined diet. He cooked at home. He avoided junk food. He didn't drink excessively. He wasn't overweight. He walked regularly, stayed active, and monitored his health. On paper, he was exactly the kind of person you would expect to have a healthy cardiovascular system. But when I reviewed his scans, something didn't match. His arteries were not in line with his lifestyle. They were stiff, thickened, inflamed. In some areas, they looked aged far beyond what I would expect for his age. In fact, if I had not known his actual age, I would have assumed I was looking at someone much older, someone who had spent decades with uncontrolled risk factors. And that contradiction is what made me stop and look deeper. Because in medicine, when everything looks right on the surface, but the body tells a different story, you start searching for the hidden pattern. So I sat down with him, not as a quick consultation, but as a detailed conversation. We went through everything slowly: his diet, his stress levels, his sleep, his physical activity, his past medical history, his supplements, his routine, his environment. And strangely, nothing obvious stood out. There was no smoking history, no major illness, no clear genetic red flags, no extreme lifestyle issues. But I've learned over the years that the real answer is usually not in the big things. It's in the repeated small things that people don't think twice about. So I asked him a very simple question. Walk me through a normal day, especially your meals. And that's when something interesting appeared. He didn't eat out much. Everything was home cooked. But he admitted something very specific. Almost every single evening, he would cook once and then reheat his food multiple times over the next day or two. Sometimes in the microwave, sometimes on the stove, sometimes with added oil again to freshen it up. He thought nothing of it. In fact, he believed it was efficient and harmless. But that one habit was part of a much bigger biological pattern. Because what most people don't realize is that after a certain age, the body doesn't respond to repetition the same way it used to. In your younger years, your 30s, 40s, even early 50s, your body has a strong buffer system. It neutralizes damage efficiently. It repairs cells quickly. It handles minor toxins, stress, and inflammation without letting them accumulate. You don't feel the consequences because your internal systems are constantly resetting. But after 60, that buffer starts to thin. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The liver processes certain compounds more slowly. The immune system becomes less precise. It may overreact in some situations and underreact in others. The elasticity of blood vessels begins to reduce. And most importantly, the efficiency of cellular repair mechanisms starts to decline. That doesn't mean the body stops protecting you. It means it stops recovering as fast as it used to, and that shift creates something very important. A smaller margin for error, which means things that were once harmless in isolation can now become meaningful when repeated over and over. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood processes in human health: chronic inflammation. Inflammation itself is not dangerous. In fact, without it, you wouldn't survive injuries or infections. When you get a cut, inflammation is what brings healing cells to the area. When bacteria enter your body, inflammation is part of the immune defense. It is protective, necessary, and life-saving. But chronic inflammation is something entirely different. It is not short-term. It is not controlled. It does not switch off properly. Instead, it stays slightly active in the background. Like a fire that never fully goes out, just keeps smoldering. And over time, that low-level activity begins to affect multiple systems in the body. It affects the inner lining of blood vessels, making them less smooth and less flexible. It affects metabolic balance, making it harder for the body to regulate energy efficiently. It affects cellular function, increasing oxidative stress and reducing repair capacity. And the most dangerous part is this: you don't feel it happening in real time. There is no sudden warning, no clear signal, no obvious symptom in the early stages. It builds silently. And this is where lifestyle patterns become critical, because chronic inflammation is often not caused by one dramatic factor. It is caused by repetition. Small exposures that seem harmless individually, but accumulate over time. And in this man's case, those exposures were coming from everyday food habits. Let's start with something very common: fried food. Most people already understand fried food is not ideal. That part is not surprising. But what is rarely understood is what happens when fried food is reheated. Cooking oils, especially commonly used vegetable oils, are chemically sensitive to heat. When they are heated once, they begin to break down at a molecular level. But when they are heated again, that breakdown accelerates significantly. The oil undergoes oxidation, and oxidation produces reactive compounds that interact with the body in very specific ways. Inside the bloodstream, these compounds create oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is one of the key drivers of vascular damage. It targets the delicate lining of blood vessels, the endothelium, which plays a crucial role in regulating blood flow, pressure, and flexibility. When that lining is repeatedly exposed to stress, it starts to lose its smooth function. The vessels become less elastic, blood flow becomes less efficient, and the cardiovascular system begins to operate under higher resistance. Not immediately, not in a noticeable way at first, but gradually. Now consider leafy greens. Spinach, kale, and similar vegetables are often considered the foundation of a healthy diet, and in their fresh state, they absolutely are beneficial. But once they are cooked and stored, chemical changes begin to occur over time. And when they are reheated, those changes can become more biologically active. The body now processes them differently compared to when they were freshly prepared. For a younger system, this difference may be negligible. But for an aging system with reduced reserve capacity, even small additional stressors matter more than they used to. Rice is another example that seems completely harmless on the surface. It is simple, widely consumed, and often seen as a neutral food. But after cooking, if rice is left to cool under improper conditions, bacterial activity can begin to develop. Even if reheating eliminates active bacteria, some byproducts can remain in the system. And the issue is not acute illness, it is repeated exposure. Because when the digestive system is repeatedly irritated at a low level, it sends signals throughout the body. And the gut is not isolated. It is deeply connected to immune function, metabolic regulation, and inflammation control. So even minor, repeated disturbances in the gut environment can influence systemic inflammation over time. Chicken introduces another layer of complexity. When reheated unevenly, it can develop temperature variations within the food. Some parts are fully heated, others are not. These cooler areas can allow bacteria to survive, not necessarily in a way that causes immediate illness every time, but enough to trigger immune system responses. Each time the immune system responds, it releases inflammatory signaling molecules. And when this happens repeatedly, even at low levels, it creates a background state of immune activation. Not enough to cause obvious sickness, but enough to contribute to long-term inflammatory load. Potatoes add a different dimension entirely. When cooked at high heat, chemical reactions occur that change their composition. Reheating can intensify certain compounds formed during cooking. At the same time, cooling potatoes creates resistant starch, which is beneficial for blood sugar regulation and gut health. However, reheating alters this structure again, converting part of it back into rapidly digestible starch. This leads to faster glucose absorption, and repeated spikes in blood sugar force the body to respond with repeated insulin surges. Over time, this pattern places stress on metabolic regulation and vascular health, especially in individuals whose systems are already less flexible than they used to be. When you step back and look at all of this together, the pattern becomes very clear. Different foods, different mechanisms, same underlying result. A continuous, low-grade inflammatory load, not dramatic, not immediate, but persistent, and persistence is what defines long-term physiological change. Over months and years, this manifests in ways that are often misattributed to aging alone. Reduced energy stability, slower recovery, increased vascular stiffness, reduced metabolic flexibility, and most importantly, a gradual decline in the body's ability to fully reset between stress exposures. What makes this particularly important is that most individuals affected by it are not living unhealthy lives in the traditional sense. They are not engaging in extreme behaviors. They are not ignoring basic health principles. In fact, many of them are doing the opposite. They are cooking at home, avoiding obvious junk food, maintaining routines that feel responsible and controlled. But it is precisely the repeated, unnoticed details within those routines that shape the outcome. Because after a certain point in life, health is no longer defined by isolated actions. It is defined by accumulated patterns, and the body reflects those patterns with increasing clarity over time. The most important realization from observing cases like this is not fear or restriction. It is awareness, because the human body, even in later years, retains a remarkable ability to adapt and respond. Inflammation is not irreversible. Vascular function can improve. Cellular systems can stabilize. But the key condition is reducing unnecessary, repeated stress, not eliminating life, not eliminating food enjoyment, but understanding that repetition carries biological weight, and what feels small in the moment becomes significant when multiplied across time. Because in the end, health is rarely shaped by one moment of decision. It is shaped by what is repeated so often that it becomes invisible.